Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Nuffield Scholars, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to you all. Now I'm stood here under these lights, I'm somewhat ruining the decision to wear a three-piece suit. I'm very proud to be standing here today as a Nuffield Scholar. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank those associated with Nuffield for giving me this opportunity and for the guidance, advice and support that you've all afforded me over the last 2.5 years. As you may or may not be aware, I'm not actually a scholar from 2010, but a scholar of 2009. Although my timekeeping was perhaps not the most well oiled, I'm not actually a year late in arriving to the conference. But owing to work circumstances, I had to postpone my planned study travel by 10 months. So who am I? Well, I'm a pretty ordinary 26-year-old man who began life as an apprentice farmer on the Land's End Peninsula. My father felt that a degree was essential to me, and completely unknown to me, filled out my UCAS forms and enrolled me on the estate management course at Cirencester. Gradually, my horizons began to broaden and my eyes began to open to the opportunities available to me. Upon graduating, great luck took me to Scotland, where I arrived to form part of the team challenged with the management of the Duke of Buccleuch's 120,000-acre Queensbury estate at Drumlanrig. Over time, my role developed, being charged with the day-to-day management of the estate and taking sole responsibility for the residential, commercial and agricultural portfolios. So why new entrants? Well, it was becoming increasingly apparent that the traditional estate model was fluttering. Looking at the Queensbury estate individually, it was interesting to see that the majority of tenants fell between the age of 50 and 65 years of age. The number of farms offered to the market under a secure tenancy had virtually stopped, and the number of farms offered to the market generally over the last decade had been pretty much non-existent. The opportunity to let land was there, but why had it not been taken forward? What were the driving factors behind this, and how could these be addressed? It was obvious to see that the Queensbury estate was not a hotspot, but rather a reflection and a mirror of the industry as a whole. There have been recurrent themes in farming literature relative to rural land markets for the last 400 years, especially the desire for people to get started in farming and the barriers that they face in doing so. Agriculture in Scotland is an ageing industry. The percentage of young farmers in Scotland is one of the lowest amongst the EU member states. There has been little in the way of intervention or targeted practical assistance to date for new entrants. The entry routes. There are three main entry routes into farming: through the family farm business, new entrants from other sectors, or via the agricultural ladder. I've identified a number of barriers faced by new entrants in Scotland. Firstly, access to land tenancy. Prior to the latest legislation in Scotland, the 2003 Agricultural Holdings Act coming into force, the only types of tenancies offered were either secure 91 Act tenancies or mowing and grazing lets. The 91 Act tenancy is the Scottish equivalent of an 86 Act tenancy in England, but with far greater security of tenure provisions. The tenant of the 91 Act holding has the right to succession in perpetuity, so in effect, the landlord of the 91 Act holding can never regain possession of that farm if the tenant can continue to assign the lease. The 2003 Act intended to free up the markets for letting in land and offered two new types of tenancy agreements. These were for specified durations with the hope that they would reinvigorate the landlord and tenanted sector. However, this has not been the case. One mode of thought behind this is that the inflexibility afforded by the legislation has prevented and has hindered the uptake of new style tenancies. For example, the landlord of the new 2003 Act tenancy is required to fully equip the holding at the commencement of the lease and put all fixed equipment into a thorough state of repair. If you take, for example, a 500-acre farm, considering all fences, dikes, field drainage systems, modern steadings and traditional steadings, the cost of this is significant. And for a landlord to do this, with the return being an agricultural rent, there is little wonder farms are either taken back in hand or offered to the market on a number of short-term arrangements. The 2003 Act intended to free up the market for the letting of land and encourage new entrants, but it also gave a 91 Act secure tenant the right to register an interest to acquire land. There are still calls from within the sector for this right to be further extended to an absolute right to buy, i.e. the 91 Act tenant having the right to buy their farm today. So on the one hand, the 2003 Act intended to free up the market for the letting of land, but on the other hand, it was wandering towards extreme estate rationalisation. High start-up costs. Farmland prices in the UK are expected to rise by 50% over the next 5 years, after they have hit a record high with 100% increases over the last 4 years. Once a new entrant has overcome the barriers of land acquisition, there are still further barriers relative to high start-up costs in consideration for financing working capital. Low rates of exit. Retirement in agriculture is often a progressive and long-term transition, not the dramatic change in lifestyle and economic rewards experienced by, for example, a blue-collar employee. Inadequate pension provision has long been identified as a problem in agriculture, making it very difficult for a farmer to retire from farming without liquidating business assets to supplement pension income. One of the main reasons exit is low from agriculture in Scotland is due to the current distribution of single farm payment, which is based solely on historical enterprises, which may, in some circumstances, have little or no resemblance to what is actually physically happening on the land today. Support measures. For a new entrant to have access to single farm payment, they must either lease or purchase entitlement. Without single farm payment, a new entrant would struggle to work towards profitability across the majority of enterprises. When bidding for a farm in the marketplace, if there isn't access to single farm payment for a new entrant, they would struggle to compete with an established farmer. Overcoming the barriers. Drawing on my studies and my travel experiences, I believe that the following should be implemented in Scotland to assist new entrants. Freedom to contract. The Scottish executives should legislate the ability for parties to write into a tenancy agreement the majority of terms relative to repairing and maintenance, rent review, term length. And I believe that this would give landlords especially the confidence to offer further farms to the market where they aren't under existing legislation. Removal of the right to register an interest to acquire land. This right should be removed, and it would show landlords that this policy was out of the political arena and off the political agenda, and again provide further confidence to let land. Removal of succession and perpetuity. I believe that this should be removed and should revert to a 3-generational tenancy for a secure 91 Act tenant, and that this should be backdated to the commencement of the original lease. Adjustment to Section 16 of the 2003 Act. In short, Section 16 prevents the landlord from letting a farm that requires without the fixed equipment in a thorough state of repair. If this section was adjusted, allowing a landlord to let a farm that required a degree of investment in fixed equipment, I believe a higher number of farms would come into the market. Quite often, the less desirable units would be the starting block a new entrant requires, as the rent accepted would be reflected by the condition of the holding. New entrant assignation grant. I believe that the occupier of a secure tenancy should have the right to assign their lease to a new entrant with no relation. This would be done on the exact and same terms as the current lease. For this, the assigner would receive a one-off capital sum paid for by the Rural Development Programme. New entrant letting tax breaks. Drawing on what the likes of France are doing, I believe that landlords who let to a new entrant could receive a partial exemption on the income tax from that letting. This would be for the first period of the lease, say up to 3 to 5 years. CAP post-2013. Arrangements required to be put into place as soon as possible to ensure new entrants have access to single farm payment or to whatever policies emerge following the CAP reforms of 2013, whether this be by top slicing or reallocation of entitlement. Planning restrictions. There currently is a presumption in favour of granting planning permission for a new house to a retiring farmer through planning policy. In practice, a limited number of local planning authorities are being sympathetic or realistic in the case of a retiring farmer comes forward. A change in this mindset would be significant. Government rent scheme. As part of the national policy, I feel that the government rent scheme should be put in place, providing a new entrant with a proportion of the rent for the initial period of a lease, say 3 to 5 years. Not only would this go some way to allow a new entrant to compete in the marketplace with an established farmer, but it would go some way in soaking up the marriage value or key money often associated with a fresh letting. Landlord reward scheme. A landlord should receive a one-off capital sum, say £2,000 per year of a tenancy awarded, up to say a limit of £10,000 for providing a secure tenancy to a new entrant. This would not only offer as an incentive to a landlord, but it would also assist for a lesser rent being accepted when comparing a tender bid of a new entrant against that of an established farmer. Existing share agreements with existing owner-occupiers with no successor, share farming arrangements, and contract farming arrangements should be promoted from within the industry as a vehicle for new entrants to build capital. As with most problems faced by agriculture, there is not a one-size-fits-all recommendation breaking down and tackling the barriers faced by new entrants. This is a multifaceted problem with a variety of reasons as to why there isn't a clear entry and exit strategy for new entrants and retiring farmers respectively. Some of these relate to the economics of farming, the high costs of farming due to both the desire for established farmers, great fixed costs across additional hectares, and also due to the influx we've seen over the last 10 years of wealthy non-farming investors. Further barriers are caused by what would seem an unwillingness to retire from existing farmers, which is cultured from poor legislation, poor tax and planning policy, and poor agricultural policy, which allows some farmers to remain in occupancy through a living based solely on subsidy support, without having to physically work the land. Many of these facets are intrinsically linked. Policy and legislation, however, are complex issues. The alterations to taxation policy is reserved for Westminster, and the shape of the next common agricultural policy is looked at in an EU context, and therefore the swift change that many desire simply cannot take place. It is important, however, that the Scottish Executive have the platform to voice their thoughts in a Scottish context. The UK requires a single negotiating position on the shape of the next common agricultural policy, and is therefore essential that there is not a divide between the DEFRA position and that of the developed countries. The world in which agriculture operates is becoming increasingly commercially minded, with a swiftly changing and unstable business environment. It may be for the bona fide, determined new entrant that a non-perfect foothold is made into the industry, with a view that this is a vehicle to build and retain capital in the business. Thank you very much.